afternoon, everyone. I'm Jana Martin, Associate Director of the Language Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm happy to welcome you to the sixth session of our Fall 2021 Language Collaboratory series. The Language Collaboratory is a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures, driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, the University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional learning opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions and other institutions. Our series this fall aims at furthering conversations on the topic of student engagement. We address this issue from 2 perspectives: research and pedagogical and practical. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging institutional distance, and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You are invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion today. To the next slide. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset, that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat. During the open discussion period, please raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning is available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Otherwise, you're welcome to ask any questions. And then today, we're pleased to welcome Noah McLaughlin from Kennesaw State University. Noah is an assistant professor of French and director of the Foreign Language Resource Collection at Kennesaw State University, where he teaches courses about world languages and cultures, as well as transnational cinema. He has publications in the fields of film studies, foreign language pedagogy, and popular culture. He has served as an online language teaching mentor for ACTFL's mentorship program and has been invited to conduct professional development workshops and presentations for language teachers by the University of Calgary and the International Association of Language Learning Technology. He also coordinates Kennesaw State's American Sign Language, Arabic, Hebrew, and Russian courses. Noah, feel free to correct me. Noah's session today is titled Engaging World Language Students with Authentic Texts and Tasks. Let me stop sharing here. Before I turn this over to our discussant today, I would like to encourage everyone to attend our next session, which will be held next Monday, November 8th at the same time. Our discussant for next week is Anne Violin-Wiegand from Michigan State University. And just a quick note for everyone, after today's session, you will receive an email inviting you to provide feedback about the session. So please consider providing your input because we really appreciate your comments. Now, without further ado, I turn this over to Noah.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good part of the day, wherever it is you may be dialing in from. I love to have visual media. I'm a media studies person at heart on top of teaching languages. So I have a bit of a PowerPoint to be sharing with you. I look forward to kind of discussing with you some of the things that I've been doing as we're working well in my classes, and then having a further kind of discussion and exchange in a couple of minutes here. So for me, a key factor of building language proficiency has always been student disposition. And students are often more engaged in their learning when they can discern its applicability beyond the classroom. And one of the best ways to do this in my teaching has been to give them authentic texts and tasks. So in the next 15-ish minutes, a little bit less, I think, I want to talk about some of the ways that I have effectively brought the outside world into my language classrooms, both in face-to-face and in online modalities. I'll begin by defining a few fundamental assumptions about my teaching, and then I'll describe 2 ways that I help students to construct meaning with authentic texts. And then I'll walk you through a high leverage teaching practice of a way to construct authentic interpersonal tasks and a way that would help students prepare their performances for that. time permitting, and there should be, I'd like to touch upon the importance of presentational mode activities and to share some kind of fine-grained tidbits about how I implement and evaluate these kinds of activities in my own classes. Here's a quick overview that I forgot, but let's get right on to some of the considerations. Some big picture items, ideas about your own teaching I'd like you to consider while I'm talking here that'll kind of guide our discussion in a few minutes. And then my definition of authentic, followed by some kind of big picture considerations of my teaching and instructional design. So first of all, the things I'd like you to start thinking about are firstly, how much does student voice and choice play a role in your classes? And secondly, how do you use currently authentic texts and tasks in your instructional design? How would you like to, and what do you need in order to reach that point? Finally, how do you generally design tasks and assignments for each mode, for the interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational mode? So moving on to the idea of authentic. Authentic for me has a particular meaning. An authentic text is one that is used for things outside of the language learning environment, something like a restaurant menu, a hotel website, or a video advertisement. Basically something that can be found out in the wild, quote unquote, that we can use to accomplish an authentic task, which is simply a communicative experience that students can have outside of school, like ordering food, making a reservation, or deciding to purchase a certain product. So an essential part of helping students to successfully interpret these texts and achieve these tasks is appropriate scaffolding. And my emphasis in scaffolding and instructional design has always been an incremental, dialogic, and even collaborative one with my students. It's my role as an instructor to identify learning objectives, to provide models of communication, and to guide students in their own preparations with questions that lead them to examine and identify language fundamentals, communicative strategies, and cultural knowledge that can help them succeed. The overall effect of this method really engages students by featuring their own voices and choices in the things that they're doing and encountering in my classes. So an incremental approach to interpretive activities is one that has student comprehension being built up in stages rather than tested after the fact. Okay? In this section, I'm going to talk about kind of two different ways that I create interpersonal, or rather interpretive assignments for authentic texts. So that is texts that are found outside of learning classroom to be used outside of learning classroom. So an interesting, significant challenge that I've encountered when I'm doing this has been actually my students' own preconceptions. Many are so accustomed to the kind of traditional semi-authentic texts in a lot of our textbooks and the pre-reading, para-reading, post-reading approach that they really kind of struggle at first with a segmented and scaffolded construction of understanding. So a metaphor that I have found successful has been that of a pearl of understanding. So instead of, say, a diamond, which is created under either artificially in a lab or under intense pressure, mollusks create pearls in reaction to an irritant, to something that's difficult, to a challenge, and they cover it gradually in layers and layers of lacquer to result in a shining, beautiful sphere. So similarly, effective interpretive activities guide students to gradually build their comprehension of a text by asking them to explore it several times. Each pass will look for something different while building upon the previous iterations. So for written and imagistic texts, I've adapted activities that first appeared from ACTFL and are associated with integrated performance assessment. First, students scan a text and I ask them to identify its topic, its genre, its purpose. Like, is this an ad, an interview? Is this an infographic about something? And then I ask them to look for and identify keywords. Often I give them a list actually of English terms, and I ask for them to look for the target language equivalents in the text itself, not to look them up in a dictionary, but rather to look through the text and find me the words that might mean the same thing. They next describe the way in which this text is organized. Like, is this in paragraphs? Is this a poem? Is this an interview? What kind of images are included that help to organize our understanding? Fourth step calls upon them to identify the absence or presence of pertinent details. I usually provide a list of like 8 different ideas or categories of ideas, 3 of which are not actually in the text, but could possibly be there. Students so then first have to identify which ideas or which categories of information are present, and then I ask them to paraphrase those categories of information that are there. These steps now provide them with enough detail to either identify or to paraphrase the main idea of the text. And then finally, I call upon students to identify evidence of cultural perspectives there. Something like French culture values formality in the workplace. What evidence do you find of that perspective in this article that we've read about such and such CEO? So for videos, I found a really useful approach in the book, A Multiliteracies Framework for Collegiate Foreign Language Teaching by Pisani, Allen, and Dupuy. This is a multiliteracies approach, go figure. And like the IPA approach to interpreting written texts, it calls for multiple passes, each looking at a different kind of information that gradually builds student understanding. The first two passes, interestingly enough, are silent. Turn off the sound and let them just look. Students are first looking for really big picture items. Again, the genre, the purpose, the general organizing principles of the video. You know, is this an advertisement? Is this a blog entry? Is it a music video? And get them to articulate how they know or why they think that. This is a good place to ask them about sequencing as well. Make sure that they understand kind of what happens first, next, and last. Next, again, a second silent pass, ask them to look for culturally specific or significant images, like what does a bank look like in the target culture? What does a marketplace look like? What are people wearing and why might that be important or strange, exceptional? The next three passes, you turn the sound on and students start listening along with the images with which they are already familiar. So the third pass is where students begin to reify information that they've been sifting through. They identify the video's important events and facts, and this is a good time to have them point out or to discuss with them kind of important angles or shots or special effects that might have been involved. The fourth pass is actually the kind of the language one, where students are called upon to identify pertinent vocabulary, important grammar. You can have them make inferences or discuss with them the translation of certain idioms, turns of speech. Finally, the fifth pass is that of critical thinking. You can have them make cultural comparisons or consider larger messages and meanings within the video. So really importantly, I think, for both of these approaches to interpreting texts, even for intermediate level learners, these activities can be, even in my opinion, should be completed in the student's L1. Okay, the purpose here is not to test how well they can produce in the language they're studying, but rather to assess how well they're understanding and to help guide them towards a better understanding. So in fact, using their primary language is a better way to assess their skills and to give them the confidence that they are actually understanding this piece. So in my experience, authentic interpersonal tasks are usually suggested by the theme of a unit or the text that you've chosen, especially like making hotel reservations, right? Or choosing which national park to visit. Helping students to succeed at these kind of tasks is really another matter. So my focus, again, is in building things in stages. And I've developed an interactive process that is actually based upon methods in the first volume of Gleason and Donato's Enhancing the Work of Language Instruction. So in fact, at Kennesaw State, we've created a template that has helped us to create 100, more than 100 actually, of these kinds of interpersonal tasks in 8 different languages. I'm going to be using a French language one that I helped to develop just as an example, but I'm happy to kind of point you to all the stuff that we've created with these. So the first thing is that it's important to establish the parameters, the context, and the objectives of this task. In here, we have students who have already kind of done a little bit of background research about what the weather is going to be like and what activities are possible or probable in the French city of Strasbourg over the weekend. So novice high students are kind of the ones that are, what's the word I'm looking for, ciblé, targeted, are supposed to be taking this. And you can see that they have each one, there are 2 different students involved, and each one has their own things that they're looking to accomplish, basically asking some questions, doing some descriptions, and then together deciding, according to the weather and their preferences of free time, things to do, what they're going to do together over the weekend. So the next step has them, excuse me, review key vocabulary and grammar to help them achieve these objectives, right? What are some common phrases? What are some likely terms? What are some ways to talk about the future and leisure activities? The next activity calls upon them to apply these fundamentals by creating phrases with specific communicative purpose and ones that are likely to be useful in their conversation. Next steps have them review pragmatics and circumlocution strategies, and then finally to consider how the target language culture might influence the task. So there are a couple notes. that I have for how this is implemented and for use with intermediate level, more advanced level students. For intermediate level learners, they're capable really, or should be capable of generating and identifying a lot of this information themselves. Novice ones, you give them a big helping hand. Intermediate level learners, I have them start by identifying likely language functions. Are you going to ask questions? Are you going to describe things? Are you going to narrate, etc.? They then brainstorm vocabulary they think is going to be useful. They then identify and paraphrase the type of grammar that they think is going to be helpful with this. And I have them identify the types of pragmatics and the kind of cultural information that they themselves think are going to be really useful here. And ideally, these preparatory activities are actually done in the target language. So unlike the interpretive activities, which is done in L1, we try and do as much preparation in the target language as possible, usually in small groups with instructor intervention kind of as necessary. We do several of these in my own courses throughout the semester. And the first time that I do it, it's very hands-on with me. So I complete these with the class as a whole. But as they continue in the semester to do these types of activities and preparations again and again, I usually have them just work with a partner or in very small groups. And I answer the questions as necessary, or sometimes I just check to see if they've done it. Like, all right, cool. It looks like you guys are in a pretty good way, in pretty good shape. Let's get to the actual performance itself. So up to this point, I've really just kind of focused on interpretive and interpersonal mode activities, but extending student learning with presentational mode activities is really important. So in my experience, coming up with the type or particular specificity of the assignment are just logical extensions of what has come before. What kind of things have we been reading? What kind of interaction did we just have? And then students can craft a video advertisement for a restaurant, or report an interview in prose form. They can narrate an imaginary visit to a national park, whatever it is that logically comes through the other two activities. But I can summarize my own practices for the kind of iteration, reiteration of these types of assignments in 3 words: preparation, publication, and revision. So process writing is really important activity. And the act of sharing one's work, kind of publishing it, really kind of adds an element of authenticity and accountability to student performances in this mode. So there are a myriad of ways to prepare a written composition or a video or an oral presentation. Students can list keywords, you can have them make idea maps, you can have them craft an outline. It's kind of up to you to select the most appropriate thing for the assignment that you're giving them for the activity itself, and to model it with them clearly. I often really work directly with the students the first time we do a certain kind of activity so that they understand how this works, because some of them are really quite unfamiliar with kind of process writing and starting without actually it being just like starting with sentences. Now, in the traditional classroom, a lot of writing and even video assignments kind of disappear into the gradebook once they've been submitted. From the student's point of view, right? They might receive feedback, they might receive some kind of grade, but effectively it kind of ceases to exist. Now, a more authentic experience that sticks with them more is to mimic the ease with which you can publish and share things in today's media universe. So I have students submit their work to a discussion board that's shared with the entire class, even their first drafts. And this has 2 benefits I found. First, it positively leverages a bit of peer pressure into their performance. Like, they're not just writing this for me, they're writing this for everybody in the class. And secondly, it provides a model for various ways that others have approached the assignment. So they can kind of see, oh, so-and-so had a really interesting way of doing this, or so-and-so told a really interesting story, which helps with their revisions later on, or with future compositions or videos that they're creating. So preparing and sharing don't complete the process, right? Students are also required in my classes to revisit their work and to revise and expand upon it. In my classes, they do this actually with a kind of a worksheet that has 3 basic steps. Right? So firstly, it starts with the worksheets, 3 steps. First worksheet, they have to look at a set of criteria that are modeled upon the rubric I use to give them their grades. They select 3 out of the 5 criteria that I use, and then they specify a particular strategy they're going to use to improve. So they'll say, I want to work on task completion, so I'm going to add information. I'm going to work on impact, so I'm going to make this more organized. I'm going to give it headers. I want to improve my language control, so I'm going to make sure that I proofread this more carefully. Then there's some sort of collaborative review in which they sit down with this worksheet and their work themselves to talk with a tutor, a peer, or sometimes even they liaise with myself. And finally, they republish their expanded and revised document onto a discussion board as well. So there's that sense of kind of improving it and then putting it back out to the public, out into the wild, where actual, real, authentic texts go. So these practices form the majority of the work in my language courses. Every week, we examine an authentic text, we do a kind of role play conversation, and we write an article or we create a video based upon those other two activities. And I strive to provide consistent models, and the repeated practice provides clear dividends in both student aptitude and disposition. So over the course of the semester, it's really clear to the students that they're getting good at doing real world things in another language. And especially when we pause, usually in mid-semester, where I point out to them all these awesome things that they've been accomplishing, the confidence boost is tangible with them. They kind of end up very often kind of doubling down on what it is they're doing because they can see that it's working and they're really learning things that seem important to them. So I find it really essential to provide students with, sorry, I jumped this paragraph, to fine grained notes. Firstly, the repetitive nature of this in my classes is that we do this over and over again. So most of these assignments are really low stakes. That is to say, if a student does poorly or even misses a few of these assignments, it doesn't really adversely affect their grade very much. We don't do a lot of high stakes assignments. We do the same little things over and over again. Students really actually tend to appreciate that. They can see that they have to build this bit by bit, and they get better and better as it goes. I also find it really essential to provide students with accessible, clear rubrics for their interpersonal and presentational mode assignments. They use those rubrics then to help them kind of prepare for high stakes performances, like end of unit evaluations, and also, like I've mentioned, for the revisions that they do of their written and video compositions. So feedback is an important, maybe almost the most important part for me. And it's best if this feedback is both timely for the students and that it's concise. So I've developed a kind of 3-point formula that's effective for them and helps me keep my sanity as well when I'm doing 60 of these over the course of a weekend. First of all, I respond meaningfully to the performance. Something like, that restaurant sounds amazing. I can't wait to check it out. And then I'll identify only the most salient error or errors, if there happen to be more than one, that really interferes with meaning or seems to be something that they're continuously stumbling upon. Something like, you struggle with effective adjective agreement. And then I give them concise, concrete advice as to how to improve that. Review the pages about adjective agreement in your textbook, or here, check out this spell checker and grammar checker online. It'll help to make sure that these are pointed out to you and you won't make these simple typo mistakes again. So this approach demonstrates that, one, I've understood what they're saying. They've said something meaningful. And two, it offers them the kind of guidance that most students are looking for without it being really overwhelming. It's not a list of these are the things you need to do that you've done wrong, but rather, here's a thing that I've noticed and here's a way for you to improve it. So including real world texts and tasks can significantly increase student engagement in your world language classroom. Okay? While these may seem really intimidating for some people, in my experience, even for instructors and students alike, in my experience, students quickly realize that not only are these kinds of activities feasible, even for novice learners, but they also contribute to more effective language learning than many traditional methods, which rely upon semi-authentic texts and communicative tasks that are contrived to fit certain grammar or vocabulary lists. So the appropriate scaffolding of these tasks is what's really key to opening up a plethora of activities that extend learning beyond the classroom. There are dialogic approaches that engage students from the beginning, methods to help them iteratively build their understanding of real-world texts, interpersonal tasks that have a kind of collaborative preparation and a real-world reflection, and then finally, process writing and public sharing of their creations to help build critical thinking skills and give them a greater sense of accomplishment. So thank you all very much. I hope I didn't go too much over time. This is really not enough to go into all the things that I like to do and that I'm really passionate about here. And I'm very happy to quit my screen sharing and answer your questions or have some more discussions about all this.
Thank you very much, Noah. This was great. Thank you very much for sharing. We do have a few questions in the chat, so I'm just gonna start with those. Evelyn is asking, can you say more about how you coach students to identify cultural perspectives and images without reinforcing cultural biases?
That's a great question. I do that a bit by I try as often as possible to use the kind of products, practices, and perspectives triangulation. So we're like, here we see these things and here we see people doing with it. Why do you think that may be? And, in the best ways of possibilities, it's kind of a Socratic type dialogue where we get to it. And sometimes it's very often comes out to be something very pluralistic, where it's like, well, very often this seems to happen, but that's not always the case, is it? You try out examples and exceptions. Equally, especially in my online courses where I don't have that opportunity to have real-time interactions with my students, I rely for perspectives on Geert Hofstede's 6D, 6D model of cultural differences. Basically, if you're unfamiliar, Geert Hofstede, and you can Google this up real quick, Geert Hofstede national comparison or national cultural comparison. He looks at all cultures across the world by 6 different spectra, ranging from something like power distance, individualism versus collectivism, long-term versus short-term thinking. He's got 6 different categories, and every single culture, especially national cultures that he's been able to, as a sociologist, to study, fall in different places along all these different spectra. And they're, of course, kind of large global things. So you come to the students as well, you're like, these are statistically significant generalizations, but it also helps us to make accurate kind of assumptions sometimes about what's likely to happen when you're in another country. When I said something like, in French culture, the preference is for formality in the workplace. I've been in some informal French workplaces, but not many. And the vast majority, if you're a newbie trying to get a job in France, is to rely upon formality until somebody there with greater authority says, you can back down a little bit. Let's be more formal together. So in that way, I go to Geert Hofstede and be like, yeah, okay. So in France, they have a pretty high, power distance, which is to say they value formality in most situations, especially at work. That's accurate. Though, of course, I usually go to pains to point out that there are always exceptions to this rule.
Yeah, thank you. Beth, you have another question about pacing. Would you mind asking it yourself? Just unmute yourself and feel free to ask it.
Hi. So I'm familiar with IPAs and I really like how you've built that model into what sounds like your weekly lessons. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by your pacing, I think. And I was wondering, you said when you start with one text and then you go through the interpretive, the interpersonal, the presentational, and the revision, and that happens every week?
Oh, no, not quite. Yeah, I was about to say that's a good question it's a great question to pose. Revision doesn't happen every week. Every week, typically they have, I do a kind of flipped classroom thing where I give them preparatory assignments basically from our online textbook. So they come in on day 1, having already looked over most of the basic language fundamentals that are in their textbook. And I do that primarily so that they stay on par with what the rest of my other instructors are doing, my colleagues are doing in the curriculum. It's also helpful, when we're talking about the weather, then they get, a whole bunch of weather vocabulary in a very discrete form. They tend to like that, right? They can be self-guided in an online workbook to do that. But when they come in, I'll usually be like, hey, so, what's the weather like today? Very first question. But then the texts are that day really will be kind of dedicated to looking at a particular authentic text, like, a weather forecast, very logically enough. And that pretty much that fills up most of our first session. The next session will generally then be dedicated to a bit of maybe some orality or phonetics and pronunciation, and then I'll have them kind of work through some kind of, we'll prepare together in 15-20 minutes tops, a kind of para activity, or perhaps even an interpersonal sondage, a survey that they go around and ask a whole bunch of classmates about, given that topic. It's usually something like, what's your favorite season and why? But we'll take the time together in class to I'll set them up with a kind of 5 W's worksheet or fill in the blank thing. Be like, okay, like, who are we talking about? Where, if I give you a thing like where, what kind of question would be logical when we're talking about the weather? What, which, et cetera, et cetera. And so the students will come up with, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 questions sometimes, whatever we can kind of generate in 10 or 15 minutes. I turn them loose basically to talk to a partner or to as many people as they possibly can. And then they'll come back and do a quick kind of reportage, a quick report about what they learned in the past bit. And all this is done as much as possible in the target language. So even with like introductory French students first semester, they'll be able to come back with something like, I talked to Jill. We haven't done the past tense, but I can give them the whole, j'ai parlé avec. And Jill likes it when it snows. Or just, Jill likes the snow. She prefers fall. Because, and so, we'll kind of lead them to kind of begin making compound phrases, and more advanced students can talk in more compound sentences, of course. Based upon that, usually for homework over the weekend, or if we have a virtual session for our third session of the week, they'll have some sort of very brief 100, 200, maximum 300 words for the upper level courses, some sort of composition or a 1 to 3 minute video that I want them to create. That's the kind of the weekly thing then that happens. Every third week-ish in my class, we have a unit evaluation where we kind of dispense with that first kind of review of fundamentals. We do some often asynchronous preparations, and then they do it's straight up IPA. So they go through a text. We go over the text together, make sure everybody understands. We make sure that everybody's got a preparatory activity for the interpersonal thing. The next day is completely dedicated to them being randomized with partners and doing their interpersonal activity. And then they're assigned a presentational mode activity. I pause in the middle of the semester. So we do 2 units, like lesson, unit evaluation, lesson, unit evaluation. And then in the middle of the semester, about week 7 or 8, we stop. And I go like, this is revision time. Grab the composition, the web page, or the video that you created for your last 2 unit evaluations, and you guys are going to take this week and you're going to revise them. So like you can kind of basically repeat that for the second half of the semester. That was long.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah. And sorry to interrupt.
No.
Since we have reached the hour, we're going to turn off the recording now. Also, we can continue with our conversation for a few minutes for those who still have some questions or comments, and we do have a few of those in the chat. Before we continue, though, I want to remind you that our next session is on Monday, November 8th at the same time. So for those of you who need to leave right now, thank you so much for being with us, spending with us.
Thank you all.
It's Monday. And for those of you who would like to go through a few more questions and stick around for a couple more minutes, we'll welcome your presence.